my presentation today is part of my next book project, which is still pretty much a work in progress. So please feel free to give me feedback. Any comments are more than welcome. This book project, effectively explores the politics of accountability that emerge in countries emerging from economic crisis. And in particular, I focus on three different approaches or three different policies of accountability. That is trials or prosecutions, commissions of inquiry, and apologies. And as you can easily infer from the title of my presentation today, I will be focusing almost exclusively on the role of apologies in countries emerging from economic crisis. So I thought, what a better way to start a presentation on apologies than with an actual apology. So here you can see Michael Martin, the leader of Fianna Fáil, one of the dominant parties in Irish politics that dominated party politics in the lead up in the decades preceding the crisis. And in 2012, he made this statement: "We have a clear duty to admit our mistakes. It's not enough to point to the worst world recession in 80 years and the Eurozone crisis. We were in government and we should have acted differently. We made mistakes, we got things wrong, and we are sorry for that." No equivocation, no half apology, just the plain unvarnished truth. So to some extent, the apology, the statement, acknowledges some mistakes on behalf of the party of Fianna Fáil in the lead up to the crisis and the creation of the financial and the property bubble in Ireland. But Martin, who is currently the PM in Ireland, is not the only example of an apology. In fact, I've quoted more than 15 to 17 similar apologies offered by former prime ministers, senior ministers, and other state officials. So it seems like there is a trend in this particular country in the aftermath of the crisis. However, this comes in sharp contrast with the comparative experience in most other European countries. In most other European countries with that face similar challenges and dilemmas like Spain, Portugal, or Cyprus, politicians were quite reluctant to offer to make similar statements of apologies. And I thought Greece is, to some extent, a good example of that trend. So despite, as you can see in the first photo, despite the gross mishandling of the crisis, the former Prime Minister Cyprus, the closest he ever came to offering an apology was in an interview in The Guardian, where he said, "I've made mistakes, big mistakes," but he alluded to the selection of people in key posts. So there is an implicit effort to dilute blame, to deflect blame in his decisions. Tsipras is not alone. The former Prime Minister Karamanlis followed a very interesting framing strategy, which is based in silence. So for the good part of the past decade, he remained silent. Although he was an MP, he did not participate in parliamentary debates. He did not give interviews. So it must have been a conscious framing strategy in response to the crisis. Having said that, Greece is not the outlier here. Greece is not the exception. In most other countries, like I said before, in Spain, in Portugal, or in Cyprus that I explore in a comparative way, by and large, politicians remained reluctant to acknowledge any wrong in the public. So this brings me to the key puzzle I want to explain, I want to explore, I want to address in my presentation today, which is quite simple. It tries to explain variation in the use of apologies in different European countries in the aftermath of the recent crisis. So there's a very simple question. Why did politicians in some countries offer apologies for their role or their actions and omissions in the creation of the crisis or the management of the crisis, while those in other countries refrained? They were more reluctant. And I focus on the comparative experience of Greece and Ireland as the two most perhaps representative cases of apologies and non-apologies, respectively. Now, just before taking any further steps, I just want to provide two caveats, two important notes. So the first one is that my approach, at least, is not driven by normative considerations. So I do not perceive an apology to be the right thing to do, or that it's necessarily it's beneficial. In fact, as I hope it will become clear in my presentation, apologies can also be part of the political theatrics. Secondly, which is I think an overlapping point, in this presentation, my sole objective is to explain the simple occurrence or not of apologies as a speech act. I'm not trying to explain or to assess their effectiveness or the truthfulness or whether they are meaningful or their impact. This is a different part of perhaps of my book that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A session. Now, you may be wondering why this is an important topic of analysis, why we should study apologies. And I think if someone reads the literature, I think there are 2 or 3 good reasons. In my view, the first one is that in the aftermath of major crisis, the state-society relations of trust are usually fractured, they are broken. So an apology, at least according to the literature, may be one of the ways or the public rituals of restoring trust to democratic institutions or to democratic politics. But most importantly, according to the literature, apologies can be seen as one of the key instruments or the key mechanisms of image repair that can be used and are used by politicians in the aftermath of wrong, in the aftermath of state and individual failure. So understanding this variation and being in a position to explain variations in the use of apologies can be beneficial, I think. Now, usually, as a comparative political scientist, I tend to say a few words about my research design or exploring alternative hypotheses. But due to the limitations of time, I will just skip this part. Like I said, I'm more than happy to discuss alternative hypotheses in the Q&A session. And I will jump directly to the arguments, not least because I'm least confident about it. So I need your feedback in order to improve the argument. So in a nutshell, I want to develop in this work an argument that builds primarily or places emphasis on the role of political culture and to some extent the role of the electoral system. So the argument in brief is that obviously in all countries emerging from an economic crisis and other types of crisis, obviously, politicians engage in a struggle for the political survival. However, the tools, the policies, the mechanisms they use in order to engage in this process or in this struggle for survival is culturally contingent. So they need to pick specific tools that are salient in their local culture. Saying sorry, for example, because this is the topic of my presentation, may have different meanings in different settings. So in some countries may be an embedded part of the political culture. So it may be a normal tool in the political repertoire, while in other countries may be a sign of weakness or may have high reputational costs, and therefore this may dissuade politicians from using this particular tool. And I think the political culture as a framework can be helpful because at the very fundamental level, an apology is an individual speech act. So it can help us shed light on the relative degree of autonomy of the individual politician vis-a-vis their own party. And we expect, obviously, that the more independent or the more autonomous an individual, the more likely it is to be able to offer an apology. More on that in a moment. So what I would like to do here in my presentation is I would like to focus on the specific mechanisms or pathways through which primarily political culture affect the prospects of seeing an apology, particularly focusing on these 2 cases in the comparative experience of Ireland and Greece. So let me start directly with this very, I think, intuitive argument. And that is that obviously we all know that, and the literature suggests that in times of crisis, in times of uncertainty, politicians tend to be particularly risk averse. So they tend to draw on the repertoire of tools, framing strategies that have been used in the past, and to some extent that they are culturally salient. So the hypothesis stemming from this, let's say, broad understanding is that in countries where apologies had already been part of the pre-crisis repertoire is more likely to see more apologies being offered in response to the crisis than in countries where obviously an apology is a foreign concept, is just an unfamiliar concept. And in order to test this hypothesis, I tried to focus to identify major instances of political failure, institutional failure, scandals in the decades preceding the crisis. So as you can see here, I just have a few, just showcase a few instances of apologies in Ireland. As you can see, since the 1990s, definitely the late 1990s, in Ireland, we can find at least a dozen of very important apologies on crucial issues, like, for example, the child abuse case in state-run schools under the auspices of the Catholic Church, which was a very traumatic chapter of in Irish politics, or the legacy of the Troubles, other cases of scandals where the prime minister or specific ministers are involved, and so on and so forth. So to cut the long story short, by the mid-2000s, definitely before the crisis, the use of apologies in the political culture in Ireland had already become a winning formula. In fact, I remember an interview with a senior advisor of a minister, and he said that he was in a meeting and one of the young and aspiring politicians said, and I quote here, "I need a good apology to make my name." So definitely it's being seen as a good, or at least an embedded part of the political repertoire. If we compare these to the Greek experience, I think my understanding, at least my effort to codify instances or framing responses in response to political and institutional failure, one can find just a handful of instances of guarded admissions of some wrong, but in my view, they would not qualify as apologies. Probably because I'm a child that was born in the 80s. The first thing that comes to my mind is Papandreou's mea culpa, which refers to a volte-face change in the foreign policy pursued by the socialist prime minister. But this would not qualify necessarily as an apology. And at any rate, these are very rare instances in the Greek political culture in the lead up to the crisis. Now, there's a second way or pathway through which I think political culture can help us understand whether it's likely to see an apology or not. And that is because political culture shapes the relative autonomy of individual politicians vis-a-vis primarily their own party. And I will just make a very quick detour here. In the relevant literature in cultural anthropology and cultural psychology, there is a specific distinction between cultures of dignity and culture of shame. By the way, my work here is very much influenced by a cultural psychologist, Iosif Kovras. And I think that this is useful here because essentially individual-based dignity cultures, in these cultures, politicians tend to possess more agency, more individual autonomy to split themselves from their own party, speak their minds without necessarily facing sanctions from their own party. I'm not saying that this is unheard of, but it's not as likely as in more collective-based cultures, like the Greek one, which in the literature they are also known as honor cultures, where essentially the party affiliation to the party and party membership is so strong that it becomes impossible, or the perceived cost of ignoring and crossing party line is much higher. And I think this is related to the historical trajectory of the state building process. So in Ireland, the state building process, and particularly the influence of the British colonial rule, helped integrate, helped ingrain in their own legal and constitutional framework, the individual agency of politicians. I know that this may sound perhaps a bit abstract, so I thought it might be better to illustrate this point by focusing on a particular instance. So in this photo, you can see Brian Lenihan. So he was appointed the finance minister in 2010 at the height of the crisis in Ireland. And he offered an apology, acknowledging some mistakes and wrongs with regards to the position, the policies of his own party, Fianna Fáil. I would like to remind you at this stage that this came 2 years earlier than the official apology offered by the party leader, the one that I presented at the beginning of my presentation today. Also, I would like to highlight here that the apology was unsolicited, there was no previous consultation with the party, and yet he faced no sanctions. In fact, and that's, I think, interesting, he was the only MP of Fianna Fáil who got re-elected in Dublin. Now, I'm not suggesting that he was rewarded, but definitely that there was no sanctions, official sanctions by the party. If we compare this, now, this logic is quite interesting because from my interviews with Greek politicians, advisors, PR experts, it seems that it's either not possible in Greece or the perceived cost of such a move, that is crossing party line, is exorbitant, is very high. And this is interesting because in the absence of apologies of this particular response, then politicians are left with three alternative framing strategies in response to scandals, in response to policy failure or institutional failure. The first response is silence. I've already presented the example of former Prime Minister Karamanlis. The second alternative strategy, which is quite common, is a response of denial or blame avoidance. And this comes in different shades. So it can be either a complete denial, which is highly unlikely. I don't have many instances of that. Most of the times it's either a form of, how can I say that? A form of denying that the wrongdoing was under the remit of responsibilities of my ministry, for example, or most of the times that we have, there were larger forces at play, so there was nothing we can do. We have seen that playing out, for example, in the aftermath of the recent wildfires in 2015 or in 2007. What I find most interesting is the third strategy, which is what I call at least blame dilution, which is a conscious effort or a conditional form of acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But this is negligible when compared to the responsibilities of others. And I use the front cover of the book, the former socialist minister, Theodore Pangalos, because he became infamous, obviously, for his response when he was asked, so what is the root cause of the Greek crisis? And he said his response was, "Ta fagαμε όλοι μαζί," we ate it up together, which is interesting because factually is correct. But the same token, if we apportion blame to the whole Greek society, then apportioning individual blame or responsibility to particular, let's say, individuals, it becomes either impossible or meaningless. There's not much sense in doing that. Now, there's a third way through which I think political culture shapes the prospects of seeing an apology or not. And I think political culture is important because it can give us a framework of the relationships or the dynamics of the relationship between the in-group and the out-group, the incumbent and the opposition. So in highly confrontational honor cultures or collectivistic cultures, like in Greece, for example, any admission of wrong or a mistake will most likely be used by the opponent, by the opposition, as an instrument to score political points against your opponents. While this is not necessarily the case in dignity cultures or in more individual-based cultures, where there is some space for in the public discourse for acknowledging wrong without necessarily this becoming an instrumental, this becoming an instrument of playing politics. So I thought that this quote from an interview with the former socialist prime minister, Kostas Simitis, is interesting because to some extent he's describing better than I do this logic. So he said, our political culture interprets any effort to take responsibility as an admission of failure. So the opposition and citizens consider honesty as an admission of incompetence. They accept neither an account nor an apology. They demand politicians' heads to be handed over on a platter. Our political culture is addicted to often unfounded denunciations by opponents to create enmity and exploit any event that can be used against the opposing party. From this vantage point, any admission of wrong is an additional mistake, and I think this is important, that politicians need to avoid. So there is a perception of cost associated with this public expression of wrong. What is interesting, I think, in my view at least, is that the inverse, this is not limited to apologies. The inverse is also true. So the public expression of gratitude to the outgroup can also be construed, can also be used against you. And I think Simitis is a very good example precisely because he was the one that expressed publicly his gratitude to the US administration in the mid-1990s for the role in de-escalating the Greco-Turkish conflict. And yet his reputation was tarnished, or definitely nobody accepted that, nobody acknowledged that as a positive step. So there are perceived costs associated with either the public expression of gratitude or the public expression of wrong in the public in highly confrontational cultures. And finally, there's a fourth way through which political culture affects the prospect of an apology. And I think this is related, I would like here to focus on the kitchen cabinet, because culture to some extent influences who are the advisors that get invited in these crisis management meetings. I think it's important to take into account the ideas of those persons who are invited to participate in these meetings, because they predetermine or they set the array of possible framing responses. So it's like a black box. I think a better way, it helps me a lot to think along the terms that the famous sociologist Robert Merton put it when he studied the corporate culture, if I recall correctly. And he said that in dignity cultures, in individual-based cultures, usually well, not the CEOs, but the leaders tend to recruit cosmopolitans. That is, apart from the members of the organization, members, experts from outside the organization, and he calls them cosmopolitans. While in honor cultures, they tend to recruit locals, that is exclusively members of the group, the in-group. So this helps me a lot because to some extent, if we have to apply this to the study of the kitchen cabinet, this can reveal a lot. So what I try to do is I try to reconstruct through interviews and media clips, what is a typical, obviously this does not refer to any particular PM, but what is a typical structure of the kitchen cabinet, what we call in Greece the morning coffee, or πρωινός καφές, in order to see who are the inner circle of the aides that participate in these meetings. And as you can see, I think the first conclusion is that there is a significant degree of overlap. So in both cases, these are dominated by party members, which is hardly unsurprising. However, at a closer look and in interviews, it was clear that there is a significant difference. So in Ireland, you see that civil servants, senior civil servants, they have a seat on the table, as well as other technocrats, for example, in the management of the crisis, very frequently members of the Central Bank of Ireland and other experts participated. Occasionally, we also had PR experts who participated in parallel, not on the table, but in parallel. So this is interesting because there are certain agendas that come into play. I'm not quite sure whether this affected the outcome, but definitely some ideas come on the table and they are being presented. In Greece, if we shift our focus on the right-hand side of this graph, once again, this is typical, it's not any specific structure. One can see that this is almost exclusive. The key term here, the key concept is trust. And I think that in the book written or published by Papadimitriou and Featherstone, they have done exceptional work in terms of describing these processes. And I hope I'm not misconstruing their argument, but the key concept here, once again, is trust. So only the most trusted members of the parliament, if not the PM, are invited. So we may have, for example, even relatives or friends of the prime minister having an institutional seat on the table. And this is important because to some extent, especially in times of crisis, you may find yourself in a situation of an echo chamber, of a group thing, essentially reproducing the very same ideas without having an external stimulus. Now, I would like to conclude here with what I am least confident about my presentation today, about the role of the electoral system and how this may affect the perception of the cost in the minds of politicians. So my understanding is that political culture sets the necessary conditions or the broad framework the mental framework in which politicians take decisions, shape their framing strategies. But in order perhaps to get a better idea of how they calculate the electoral cost, it's important to take into account the electoral system. And my understanding from the literature is that we would expect that, or at least the literature suggests that in PR system, in proportional representation systems, they tend to be associated with more moderation and consensus building. So appearing to be unapologetic or refraining from taking responsibility may be seen as a barrier to coalition building. So you may not necessarily be rewarded if you refrain from taking responsibility. On the contrary, in Greece or in countries with majoritarian systems or majoritarian elements, to put it more appropriately, precisely because of the political game is more framed or is being featured with zero sum as confrontational. So it's more difficult or is more costly to take responsibility for wrong or policy or institutional failure. So let me describe very briefly, and I will conclude very soon. Let me provide a very brief description, and perhaps overly simplistic, of the electoral system in Ireland, which is called PR, proportional representation, STV, single transferable vote, which is quite a unique version of proportional representation. In a nutshell, voters, they rank order the preferences of their selected candidates, irrespectively of their affiliated parties. So they can even pick candidates from different parties, political parties. And I think that this is important because to some extent, politicians compete to attract not only the traditional party base, but also voters from other parties. In turn, I think that this, to some extent, incentivizes moderation and individual accountability. It's quite interesting because I haven't thought about this, but it came up in a lot of interviews, and particularly with an interview with the former Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, who said that you want to win an election on party brand alone here. Say, if you had an election today and your party was particularly strong, but there was some person involved in a controversy, some kind of a dishonor, they would probably still lose, except if they came up and said, you know, this is the way it is, essentially giving an account of what happened. And it's not, I think it's interesting that this comes from Ahern, who is, in my view, at least the norm entrepreneur. He's the person of the politician that launched the idea of using an apology as a political instrument in Irish politics. And in fact, he used this in most of the cases, like child abuse, where most of the instances of state-run schools where child abuse was observed, it was in Dublin, in his own district. So I found that particularly interesting. On the other hand, in Greece, we have what we call a reinforced proportional representation, but according to Leiphart, there are significant elements of majoritarianism. I will come back to this in a point. I think this affects both the rationale or the calculation of the cost on behalf of the individual politician, but also the party line as well. So from the perspective of the individual politician, while in Ireland we have several cases of examples of MPs who get elected or re-elected as independents. So to some extent, there is some life, there is survival outside the confines of the party. In Greece, this is also impossible, and we know that because at the very least, you need the support of the party to get into the party list. But most importantly, I think it shapes the party strategy So it's highly unlikely to see an apology being used as a conscious strategy from the organization. Because there is this, at least it used to be until very recently, for the past decades, the 50 or 40 previously seats premium being allocated to the party that secures the plurality of the votes. And I think this is important if we take into account that this is almost a sixth of the total share of the seats in the House. So we have to understand that also in most majoritarian systems, the mainstream parties, dominant parties, are usually pro-churches. I mean, they are mosaics, they're umbrella organizations that host different factions, ideological factions. So for example, Syriza, one can find factions from the radical left to more social democrats and so on and so forth. Likewise in New Democracy, where one can find for example, an established conservative part of the party, liberals, and so on and so forth. So all I'm saying is that in order to secure the plurality of the votes, which is a really important part of the electoral strategy, you need to mobilize all these factions. So apologizing, and I think this is interesting if one thinks the recent developments within Syriza and the effort of the leader to take any responsibility with regards to or the appearance of supporting specific individual politicians, I think to some extent could be associated with this effort to protect specific factions within the party, because otherwise the party will disintegrate and it will be impossible to secure the plurality of the vote. So you need to polarize the debates, to polarize the public discussion. And this does not play well with an apology, obviously. So I will stop here. I'm looking forward to having your feedback and Stathis, obviously, feedback. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Iosif, for this excellent presentation. Stathis, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Iosif, for your presentation. This is an interesting and intriguing question. And for someone who knows the two cases, I would say the puzzle doesn't really come as a descriptive puzzle. It sounds very close to reality. And I think that raises a question about the framing of the paper itself. So let me start with the central question for me, which is the so what question. Assuming that descriptively, and I think that's the strength of the paper, you show very effectively, especially in the appendix, that there is a clear difference between the two cases. In one case, apologies are being offered on every major contentious issue, and on the other case, that is not what is happening. The question is, why should we care about this disparity? And you point, in a sense, to the need for the creation of trust. And my argument here is that this is not a very persuasive answer, either because, as I'm going to argue, if we have a cultural equilibrium, trust is off the equilibrium path, doesn't matter, or because what matters from a democratic theory perspective very often is accountability rather than trust. So I'm not going to go into detail into the 2 points. Just to make the second point, what we care about in a democracy is whether people who are perceived as being responsible for something are punished, accountability, and therefore that should be our criterion for why and how we should evaluate politicians and what they do, rather than trust, which very often leads to very vague arguments about how democracies operate. Or alternatively, if we have a cultural equilibrium, which is different in both systems, which I think you make effectively a very convincing case of, you have, say, cultures, as you call them, of dignity and cultures of shame, then my argument is you have different cultural equilibria. The concept of cultural equilibrium is not very well understood and hasn't really taken root, but there's a very interesting paper that I recommend very much by David Layton and Barry Winecast, published in 2006. And the basic idea here is that in every political system, you have a set of expectations that is understood by everyone as a focal point, is common, is a cultural equilibrium, in other words. And if that's the case, then in Ireland, you have a cultural equilibrium in which not to apologize for something that went wrong, even if you're not directly responsible, incurs a cost rather than, in a sense, offers a benefit. So you pay a cost for not doing what you're expected to do. In a cultural system, in a cultural equilibrium in which that is not the case as in Greece, offering an apology, even if you're responsible, when nobody expects you to do so, incurs a cost. And therefore, there's no puzzle. People behave precisely in the ways in which their cultural equilibrium predict that they will behave. It's a powerful argument in the sense that I think it explains the variation. It is an argument that is, in a sense, located at a higher level of analysis compared to the alternatives. I'll give you just an example. Your argument about reputational costs can be embedded in the argument about cultural equilibrium. In a cultural equilibrium in which apologies are not expected by anyone, you don't pay a reputational cost. Therefore, there's no question and there's no puzzle why you're not going to do it. Therefore, I don't think that the alternatives really offer you traction analytically or empirically. And the same has to do, I think, with what takes the bulk eventually of the paper and the bulk of the presentation, the discussion of the kitchen cabinet and the discussion of the electoral system. I think at best, this discussion is redundant. If we have a cultural equilibrium, every institution will operate in a way that doesn't go against it. Therefore, why discuss it? Or it is completely irrelevant in the sense, as I said, that it doesn't add any new information. It doesn't help us better understand the mechanism. It just confirms, at best, you could argue, evidence that people and politicians in this particular case indeed behave in the way you predict or you expect them to behave, given the cultural conditions that prevail. So, given that, I think you have a very nice paper, the first part of the paper, which establishes the fact and provides very solid evidence and very convincing and persuasive evidence that you have two different kinds of equilibria. So that is good. And the question is where to go from that observation. I think there are basically two ways to go from there. One, well, perhaps three. One is to provide additional evidence that cultural equilibria underlie these two conflicting or contrasting behaviors that we find. And to do so, I would say you provide a lot of very convincing evidence about politicians. What would reinforce the paper would be evidence from the perspective of the public. And that could come in two forms. You could have, for example, a survey experiments in which you would ask people whether they would be more willing to punish politicians who accept blame for what they did. And it may be that what you find is that it doesn't really affect accountability. In fact, we know from the Greek case that non-offering apologies really didn't save politicians. But my conjecture is even if they did offer apologies, they wouldn't have been saved from accountability. So that would be, I think, a nice additional piece of evidence about the behavior of the broad public. And I think survey experiments would be the best tool for doing that. The second one is to study change, because these cultural equilibria exist in time and place, but over time they change. And you've done work on, say, transitional justice, truth and reconciliation commissions, which are institutions that induce change in what people expect. That is, they change cultural equilibria. And I think perhaps finding a case in which you can observe changing behavior as the result of processes of diffusion, in which behaviors and expectations of behaviors internationally spread, that I think would add to the paper an additional element. So an understanding of shifts over time. And the other would be to look at outliers, situations in which, even though you have a cultural equilibrium, apologies are not offered in the case of in a situation like Ireland, or apologies are offered in a situation like Greece? What explains those outliers? And that would be an argument that perhaps would reinforce what you find, or perhaps would signal a process of change. That is, from the perspective of countries in which there is an expectation of apology, what is the hard boundary of offering an apology? When do politicians actually stop short of doing so? And from the perspective of a system in which apologies are not expected, when do we actually observe them? You could find, for example, that they're being observed in situations in which there is no cost and benefit, very soft kind of situations. Or more interestingly, you could find evidence that there is variation in the type of issues in which perhaps those kinds of apologies are being offered or not. So I'm not sure where to go from that in terms, since this is a book project, as I understand it, in terms of how to take it, but certainly I would very much recommend that you get rid of the electoral system and the kitchen cabinet. I didn't find that adding to your argument. I would certainly push you to provide a stronger theoretical justification of studying apologies and of embedding them into, I think, a better framework, which is this idea of cultural equilibrium. And I would encourage you to think of empirical tests that allow you to tease out both mechanisms and change over time. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Stathis. Iosif, you can now respond. If you want, you can stop sharing the screen so that.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, apologies for this.
Okay, and people can also post their questions in the Q&A space. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Stathis, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. And this is exactly what I was looking for in terms of getting some advice of where to go. Like I said in my presentation, the aspect or the part of the framework that I was least confident about was the electoral system. So this gives me some guidance. Thank you so much. I just have a very quick question to Stathis, if I may ask. All these are very useful and helpful notes and ideas and comments. With regards to the evidence from the public, you mentioned survey experiments. We had a discussion in the past around similar issues. So I was just wondering whether you would go about having survey experiments or perhaps conjoined experiments, like presenting alternative forms like either trial, punishment as opposed to an apology, and how this would affect the behavior. Do you think this would work, or you would prefer, or you would advise a survey experiment?
It depends on it depends on what exactly you want to find out. There are two different kinds of issues here. One issue is trying to understand how people understand apologies, current framework, and the second one is how do they, whether they reward or punish politicians who deviate from a certain equilibrium. So depending on the kind of dependent variable you want to select, you will design the experiment, either the conjoint or the survey experiments accordingly. I think my general perspective. So number one is method should match the question you ask, and the second thing is keep it as simple as possible. Try to show, for example, if you can show that irrespective of whether people believe that non-offering an apology or offering an apology is important, they behave as if that didn't matter, because in a sense they price in either apologies or absence of apologies. Then that would be, I think, a powerful argument for the idea of a cultural equilibrium on the one hand and accountability on the other hand, as opposed to trust. And I think if you want to move in that direction, and if you write a book, I think there is a very nice argument to be made that what matters in a democracy is accountability more than trust. But that's my personal view on the matter.
Yes. Thank you so much, Stathis. Yeah, I appreciate it.